terrific time reading the untold histories of geoengineering in the long heat. And, it obviously resonated a lot with the book. So I'm happy that we could make a time to sit down and record this conversation.
No, thanks for having me.
But yeah, let's start by talking about adaptation. In the book, you and Andreas refer to it as a kind of muscular adaptationism that emerges in a way like as an ideology and a rhetoric out of COP. I forget which exact COP, but you see maybe with the Paris Agreement this recognition of the need for adaptation, and then like certain world leaders like Emmanuel Macron really start leaning into this language of muscular adaptation. And I find like it has almost like a trickle down effect where now local leaders, like here in Nova Scotia, there's this bigger investment in, more sophisticated water bombers, while
Hmm,
they cut climate funding. They cut funding for mitigation, and
right.
they shift money over to better wildfire management. Like this is the rhetoric. I wondered if you could talk about, this term you use, this muscular adaptationism, as this kind of normalized kind of language, and also like how adaptation in general seems to just reinforce in some ways the logic of industrializing the whole of the earth, like seeing the earth as a mechanical system.
No, absolutely. And I mean, maybe good to just begin for your listeners to say that. I mean, the reason why we focus on muscular adaptationism, as we call it in the book, is that the one of the main themes throughout the book is this kind of extremely heavy reliance, of course, on technologies and technological optimism that really pervades also the carbon removal and geoengineering space. I mean, we start with adaptation to just indicate that this is something that you find throughout, and it also maybe even has its longest kind of legacy in the conversation on adaptation, which of course has been there for a while, and where these concerns that adaptation was being used in some ways as a substitute for mitigation, and that this idea that it will go hand in hand has proven to be naive at best, right? So I mean, this is really the reason why we set up the whole conversation around this the way we do, and so what we argue is that um, no doubt adaptation is important, and we can definitely see and identify ways in which you could, do adaptation in a good way, and there's even an imperative to try and do that, of course, because no matter what we do in terms of mitigation, we'll have some heat that we need to deal with. But in practice, in the real world, what you find is exactly these examples that we highlight, right, where adaptation is being used. Um, or being talked about in a way that kind of obscures the drivers of climate change, and that takes attention away from that. And so we mentioned these examples in France of the mega bassins, these massive water reservoirs that are meant to provide an adaptation solution for agriculture, essentially preserving water in winter to be used throughout the year, and that of course have had a lot of pushback from the environmental movement there. Um, and so we demonstrate some of these tendencies where you end up with a form of adaptation that is really almost a an extension of this extremely you know uh, I mean, both eco-modernist, technological solutionist, but also, of course, extremely unequal application of climate solutions, where it's really, the wealthiest, those with muscular capital, are able to, build seawalls for their own private enclaves, and then, the people outside of that are left to suffer the consequences, and often, directly so, because, and in a way, you often push the problem then outside of those protected areas, right? So that is kind of the dynamic we're trying to play with. That comes. back throughout the book, this tendency for certain solutions that are very techno-optimist to be used as substitutes for, the kind of dealing with the real problem, the kind of emission reduction, mitigation priorities that we should be keeping in focus throughout.
Yeah, and I mean, like, you talk about particular figures, these like meta entrepreneurs, as Imre Zeman calls them, like Elon
Mm,
Musk, and just the, wholesale faith that they place in technology.
right.
Um, and you basically describe it as an escape from reality. That's what this
Mm,
technology function as. But it's also like I like that you emphasize that it's also a form of like gaslighting, which
mm,
is a term you use in place of kind of like greenwashing. There's a moment in the
mm.
book where you say like this established language of greenwashing. It's like of course it's greenwashing, but it's also more than that.
Yeah.
It's a form of gaslighting, and that term itself has this interesting history in a particular play in which a man is like undermining the his wife's like confidence in reality, and but it also has to do with like the use of natural gas to like heat and light homes. So it's like it's like a very rich kind of term that you put in there in place of greenwashing. Did you want to talk about? I mean, because like in many ways, all of these eco-modernist or techno-utopian solutions are a form of gaslighting, but it seems to kind of matter who is deploying them, right? So like it feels often like governments that are in league in many ways with fossil interests are interested in using adaptation almost as like a form of gaslighting, while largely it's like mega corporations and especially energy companies that are interested in using geoengineering and carbon capture as well, maybe in particular carbon capture as a form of gaslighting. Did you want to reflect at all on that sort of like conceptual framework that you put in the book in place of greenwashing? This idea that what we're looking at is like a form of gaslighting.
Yeah. I mean, so I guess it connects to this kind of dual use we have of both a, Marxist political economic analysis based on this distinction between, or the kind of critique of, I guess, this reliance on markets and the problems with profitability and carbon dioxide removal in particular that kind of, come back throughout and that, essentially make this a form of uh, yeah, form of gaslighting and a form of very unreliable, uh, you know, set of proposals for how to deal with climate change at all. But then we connected, of course, to, question of denial and repression and this kind of more Freudian kind of language and framework that I must say Andreas in particular is responsible for in the book.
Mm. Mm-hmm.
But that we use especially with geoengineering, right? In the sense that, it's this kind of it's an attempt, it's a belief in magic in a way. It's an attempt
Right.
to this kind of, taking absence from reality and this kind of lack of a reality principle in a way, right? So
Yeah.
where um, geoengineering is essentially used as as a mask, as a veil for continuing with the problem. So instead of doing something about it, you just repress it. You put a veil over it that kind
Mm-hmm.
of addresses the symptoms, but not the underlying uh, drivers. So I guess that's
Mm-hmm.
in a sense kind of what connects all of the discussion in the book.
Mm-hmm. And I mean, like, the thing for me is that it's just remarkable how effective it appears to be. And you can point to
Mm,
the fact that there is an incredible consolidation of wealth and power and an extraction of agency from regular people as perhaps
right.
the reason why all of this kind of, uh, um, supplanting of reality with fictions like
Mm,
work, right?
yeah.
There's, but like, it is extraordinary to think about how like in Canada, research shows that, an enormous number of people think about climate change like every single day, right? That's
Mm,
beyond like acknowledging that it's real. That's about like fixating on the fact of it. And
mm,
yet, most Canadians do not believe that other people think about climate change that amount. So there's this like
mm,
weird perceptual disconnect that it
mm,
seems like the powers that be can largely exploit. And one of the things that you say, in part through this kind of psychoanalytic framework that Andreas is interested in, is that politics in the long heat is a recurrence of the same with a kind of
mm.
faux novelty, right? Like you just
Yeah,
kind of recycle the face of it. But what you're
yeah.
seeing is really a perpetuation of the exact same strategies. And when I read that, I was like, that makes a lot of sense. And I immediately thought of this Frontline documentary series. They did a series of like just, analyses of the power of fossil fuels, where the title of each of these big like 2 hour chunks are denial, doubt, and delay. And these
Mm,
are, you could argue, the kind of three epochs of kind of, incrementalism that allows this enormous amount of fixed capital to stay in place.
right.
But I think you two are right to say, whether you call it denial, doubt, or delay, and yes, there are things subtly that mark those moments. It's still the recurrence of the same with faux novelty.
Yeah.
I wonder if you could talk about that and maybe the book's sort of method of engaging with that, because you're doing like a lot of interviews and field work that like exposes how embedded, entrenched, wrapped up in this kind of perpetuation of the same through faux novelty folks in the industry and all of these different permutations of the industry are. um, what was that like to actually like go out and test some of these observations by finding the people who are, you know, invested really in recycling
Mm,
this same strategy of like denial, doubt, and delay?
yeah. So, I mean, it's interesting because it really connects, I think, to some of the things that have been happening since the publication of the book, because there's been this, strong argument, even on the left, that, we're past this kind of outright, literal climate denial, right? And that we've now entered some kind of phase of climate delay and things are, everybody has accepted climate change. And now we're just like, we're seeing a change in tactics. But I mean, this has been completely falsified, of course. We see a total resurgence of literal climate denial in just the last year. And of course, what's happening in the US is the clearest example of that. So, I mean, this is where, all these things come together, I think, where, the kind of, there's no real linearity in this. And you see this kind of, cycles yeah, exactly as you say, of the same. And this goes with, these technological solutions as well, right? I mean, carbon removal is just another iteration of the hype around carbon capture and storage that we saw just a few years ago, or another iteration of, the whole carbon market, carbon offsetting, hype.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so there's really been, I mean, you could maybe even call it these kind of hype cycles that just keep repeating themselves, right? And then there's like a total collapse of it, and then it just comes back after a while. Um, and I mean, in terms of methods, like, I mean, what's been interesting for us is that, of course, we've been doing interviews and so on, but I think. I mean, to me, that comes out most clearly maybe through the kind of I don't know. I like to call it some kind of event ethnography. We just followed a lot of these like industry events and international conferences, and a lot of that is online these days. So, but I mean, it's there where you see this most clearly, I think, because the people themselves who are in these spaces are in some ways totally aware of this, right? I mean, they're very aware of the kind of flaws and the problems with this, and maybe less so about the kind of histories of it, but you definitely see a recognition that something's not quite working. It's just that they can't seem to get out of this belief in the exact same solutions that they've always believed in, right? Or that, the generation before them has believed in. And this is like, markets are going to have to come in and it's private capital that is going to fund this. Then, we're going to find a business model that is profitable somehow. And in the absence of that, we have a problem. And this is kind of the conversation that, people are like perpetually stuck in, I suppose. Um, so yeah, I mean that's been interesting because some people are very. I mean, a lot of our interviewees as well have been very upfront about these kind of challenges, right? So I don't think there's any taboo around that. It's just that nobody kind of can see a way out of that kind of exits this kind of set framework of the market and this kind of neoliberal approach to environmental regulation.
Right.
Um, and I should also say, I mean, this is one of the reasons why there's quite a bit of history in this book as well, right? To show these kind of recurrences and this kind of continuation of much of the same.
Hmm.
I think the long history of both carbon removal and of geoengineering is extremely enlightening for you know what the future might hold for these technologies, right?
Hmm. Hmm.
So yeah, I mean, this is why in some ways the book is an exercise in history writing as well.
Yeah, I see that. I mean, like, I was pretty blown away by the fact that there are references to like geoengineering as far back as like the 60s, like mid
Mm.
60s, memos, reports to Lyndon Johnson saying, like, this is happening and maybe we should look at shooting some particles into the atmosphere to reflect
Yeah.
back sunlight. That was pretty incredible to me. But in terms of this like event ethnography that you refer to, um, one of the moments that stood out was I think this conference in 2006 in Saudi Arabia, where you have Aramco, one of the largest corporations, if not the largest corporation, like in the history of capitalism,
Mm.
um, you know, sort of marketing this idea that other oil majors, other energy companies can market themselves as abating their emissions by doing things like planting mangrove trees and so on.
Mm.
Um, there's a moment in that hit part of the history where you talk about the bellicose rhetoric of these kind of energy execs and leaders and so on. And I think like that was the thing that I found really interesting about, or one of the things I found really interesting about the history that you offer, which is that they're protesting too much. There's a way in which, when you ask them, they are upfront, but they're like a
Mm.
little too aggressive
Mm.
about insisting on the inescapability of fossil fuels.
Mm.
And that seemed to recur throughout the book. The Because of course, like, what I think the book is pointing to, and you stated in the conclusion, is that we need a radical alternative to that sort of idea that we are completely shackled to fossil
Yeah.
fueled infrastructure, that goes beyond really exposing the lie, and on some level takes it as the task of revolutionaries to sort of use crisis, to recognize that crises are moments of opportunity. We
Mm.
are in one of those conjunctures right now where we are absolutely surrounded by bellicose rhetoric that says if we don't unblock the Strait of Hormuz, the global economy is
Right.
toast.
Right.
Can you talk about like what that radical alternative looks like for you in this particular moment where we're reminded that like that 20 million barrels of oil that is blocked in the strait is a must have for the global economy?
Yeah.
That just can't be our reality, and yet it's constantly being kind of reinforced in
Yeah.
every report that we see about the emergency that the U.S. and Israel have created in Iran.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I mean it's a good example of maybe the dynamic that we highlight, as you say, like in moments of crisis and upheaval, this is where, cracks emerge in the system, and this is where alternatives become possible. And so you're right in that a big part of this book is about questioning this notion that, fossil fuels is the inevitable future, and that and showing that this is the ideology that permeates all of this, right? This kind of delimitation of what is possible in terms of climate futures. Um, and it's very, I mean, it's very interesting in the current moment that a lot of people are pushing on this point, right? They say like, we're in exactly the same position as we were after the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and particularly in Europe, right? Where, it's very obvious that, we're vulnerable because of the extreme amounts of, natural gas and oil that we import. The obvious solution would be to, go full on renewable and, reduce your energy dependence, and then you won't be in this situation. Because of course, and yeah, I mean, a lot of people are pointing this out at this moment. This is the reality of fossil fuels in a geopolitical unstable climate. Your prices go up and down. You're completely vulnerable to them. And instead of, and I guess, I mean, European leaders they face a choice, right? I mean, either they now, reshift to, I don't know, importing Russian gas, I guess, as, they're to some extent considering, or try and, increase gas imports from the US again. All of these seem like extremely um, dumb things to do at this moment in time. I predict if you want to, unshackle yourself from the US economically, militarily, as I think, is a pretty strong case to be done at the moment. Um, so I mean, there's this choice for them, and the obvious choice would be, I guess, to yeah, just go full on heat pumps, clean energy, electrification, and I mean, there's so much that you could do to rapidly speed this up. And not that China is some kind of enlightened example, but at least it shows us something in terms of, what that might look like in pure kind of scalar terms. So so yeah, I mean, I think the radical alternative is pretty clear at this point in time. I think even from a from a purely economic perspective, I mean, I hate having to bring arguments down to that, but I think even from that perspective, it probably makes sense. I think if you would do a kind of analysis of what it would cost to kind of, massively subsidize heat pump rollouts and solar panels and, wind turbines across the EU, for example, compared to, the cost of continuing to import oil and gas and the very many geopolitical uncertainties with that in the future, and what it would mean in terms of cost for defense and continued reliance on Russia. I'm not even sure it would look that bad economically.
And I like that you point to that because, there is this shift in the rhetoric of folks on the kind of like vaguely defined eco-socialist kind of left
Yeah,
to speak that language of the market because, in part, of the, seemingly utopian example that China becoming the first electro state provides, right? So like Bill McKibben's new book, Here Comes the Sun,
right.
feels like the best example of this, where
Yeah,
it's now easy to just like point to the economic advantages of shifting to renewables. But you're resistant to that now, and you're resistant to that in the book, saying that it's fantasy to imagine, that shift being one that preserves growth in the form that we have it.
mm,
That seems to be the big thing. Is like, it's a dead end conceptually and politically if what you're trying to say is that you will have the same level of prosperity that you
right.
currently have. You really have to kind of shift the terms that we use, and that's difficult for certainly mainstream news, and the kind of doctrine of neoliberalism to do. Like it's very difficult. That's
Yeah,
why we hear that 20
yeah,
million barrels of oil that's blocked in the Strait of Hormuz, and the natural gas especially, and the fertilizer and all of this stuff is a must-have for the global economy. Is that we're still really, hinging all of that on this logic of perpetual growth.
Mm.
And, you know, the book is an attempt to, I think, in many ways undermine that by trying to foreground the fact of survival, of, you know, like the need to really foreground the planet's limits.
Mm.
So, and maybe it makes sense here to shift to talking about geoengineering, which is, it feels like a gaslighting appeal to that question of survival, and still like an attempt to commodify even that hope for, you know, the
Yeah.
survival of the world's people. So you say in the book that, you know, doing geoengineering could have advantages. And this again is like affirming the fact that the book is not explicitly anti-technology. You say in the beginning
Mm.
of the book, like you're kind of, you know, agnostic as it were on technology as such, like the material fact of technology.
Mm.
People would not have to go through as many and severe and deadly hot spells as under untreated business as usual. With less heat entering the oceans, hurricanes would be less frequent and powerful. Avalanches in the tipping elements might be arrested. You know, the injections begin right away. The Earth is cooled down to zero point 0.5 degrees Celsius over pre-industrial times. You know, sea level rise would tail off. The AMOC, the Atlantic Meridional Oscillating Current, I think it's called, might be kept in some degree of motion. How irresistible a temptation geoengineering might become, you say, in the near future. Virtually overnight, it would work wonders for the heat. But the issue, as you say later on in the book, is that it's being proposed as an alternative to quitting fossil fuels. That's the dangerous fantasy. It's like you don't have to change anything. You can just put this, as you say, iron dome on the Earth, and go on as normal. What for you is so fundamentally dangerous about this model of geoengineering, and so also like tempting and tantalizing about it?
Yeah. Yeah. So, I mean, as we say, I mean, I think there's no doubt in the literature that geoengineering would work at a global scale, right? It would bring temperatures down. There's like, there's the historical analog is the volcano. Volcanic eruptions, large volcanic eruptions have done this historically. So, the big uncertainties are about what else it would do. And so that means there's a lot of uncertainties with the side effects of it in terms of, how it would shift regional climates, precipitation. Some regions will become drier, some would become wetter. You have a scrambling of the climate as we know it in a sense. So it's extremely important to know that a geoengineered climate is not a climate without warming. It's a totally new climate with maybe the same, you know, global average temperature as, when we had, uh, I don't know, 100 parts per million less of CO2 in the atmosphere, but it would be a completely different climate at the regional and the local level. And I think that's extremely important to remember. And so the reason this is important is because if you do geoengineering without at the same time phasing out fossil fuels, without at the same time prioritizing emission reductions, then you would be forced to continue increasing your amounts of aerosols that you inject in the stratosphere, right? Because,
Mm,
the more emissions you continue to have, the harder you would need to repress the symptoms of that. So
mm-hmm.
over time, your suppression would have to increase. And that also means that the side effects would increase, of course. And that is where things become dangerous, right? While the side effects might be manageable with relatively modest levels of geoengineering, I mean, the more you increase them, the more severe they would get.
Mm,
So that's one big problem. The other one is the one that we call termination shock. Termination shock essentially is the idea that, if for some reason the geoengineering efforts are ceased at some point in time, it could be because of some natural catastrophe or also just because, imagine a US president either, dislikes this, doesn't want to fund it anymore, or, realizes that the side effects become too severe and therefore shuts the thing down. Um, or, there's a geopolitical conflict and it prevents, whoever is doing it from continuing to do this. There's plenty of, ways in which this could happen. Then essentially you would, have all of the warming that has been repressed so far, emerge in one go again. And then you would have a very rapid warming over a matter of, few years, few decades on a scale that is, unseen even with current anthropogenic levels of warming, and that would therefore be unadaptable. So this is an extremely catastrophic scenario when you talk about climate change, of course. So this is the thing, right? I mean, in theory, in principle, you could, devise some kind of nice scheme by which geoengineering goes hand in hand with phasing out fossil fuels. But that's an illusion in the sense that we don't have an international governance system that, could manage that. We don't have a coalition of states that have shown the willingness or the ability to collaborate on that level, because this is exactly what they failed to do with mitigation, of course. So it's extremely unclear to see how that would happen. In the real world, you would probably have, one actor going it alone, and so you would have to have negotiations over where, at what latitude, to what extent, and what amounts geoengineering is done. And all of that would have effects on how the side effects of this are distributed globally, right? So I mean, it's a scheme that is really pregnant with geopolitical the possibility for geopolitical conflict. Um, and so we find it extremely unlikely to imagine that, whoever would be doing this would at the same time suddenly, decide that phasing out fossil fuels or, even just reducing emissions more radically than is currently the case, um, would also be a priority, because this is historically exactly how these technologies have not been used. And so if that is not the case, then, you end up with this kind of increasing side effects and increasing risk or disastrous capacity of termination shocks.
And yeah, I literally just wrote down nightmare. Like it's just such a
Yeah.
nightmare. And part of the nightmare scenario that you describe in the book, which is, rooted in the science, but also a deep reading of kind of these geopolitical clashes and brinkmanship and so on,
Hmm.
is that like if you want to imagine a future from the present in which it's going to be private companies based in Israel, like AWZ, that, market the technology of genocide, or a U.S. hegemon that has the
Hmm.
largest military in the history of the world, that like these are the primary actors in
Hmm.
geoengineering, then you're, if you extrapolate from that to the future, you're talking about a really frightening consolidation of power
Yeah.
within this like imperial core.
Yeah.
I hadn't really thought of it in those terms before reading the book, and I hadn't
Hmm.
seen it anywhere else. This idea that like putting it in the hands of like the US military or the IDF means that you're suddenly reliant upon those powers to protect the entirety of the Earth's sort of
Yeah.
livability.
Exactly. Yeah.
That was striking for me, just in terms of like extrapolating from the current moment. Whereas you say, one of the other insights in the book is that we, like, you talk about the Gaza genocide and the ways in which the, indescribable carnage there seems to almost be an object lesson, and in sort of the extent to which we are now required to accept the level of suffering that
Hmm.
1.5, 2 degrees, 3 degrees,
Hmm.
4 degrees might bring. Um, yeah, I mean, like, I just wondered if you had any thoughts on, like, what it means to kind of connect the sort of, the logic of sacrifice zones and the kind of banality of climate refugees, now the largest source of refugees on the planet, with the, war on all fronts that the United
Yeah.
States and Israel are
Yeah.
waging.
Yeah, I mean, this is a very good question. I mean, well, I mean, we talk about this in the book in terms of this notion of bourgeois coldness, in particular, right? This, ability of, you know, the West and, the capitalist classes in particular to just look away from the suffering that is being uh, rained down literally on, people in Gaza and in Iran and much of the global south, of course. And so this really, I think, spells what I mean, this is exactly the logic that leads you to muscular adaptation, right? It's the logic that leads to these forms of techno power that we describe for carbon removal, where, you would do carbon removal at the cost of whatever the land impacts and food security impacts would be on people in the global south. This is the logic that drives a form of geoengineering that would be, totally blind to the side effects that they would have on Pakistan or on the people relying on the Asian monsoon, for example. So,
Hmm.
um, I mean, this is in essence why we are so extremely critical of this notion of rational optimism and this kind of, high-flown, lofty idea that we could somehow do geoengineering in a rational and planned way. Um, the way in which these technologies would be rolled out, you just have to look at geopolitics today. You would have Donald Trump, Vladimir Putin, and Xi Jinping as the people de facto, having the vast majority of the power over this, right? So they would be the de facto, yeah,
Hmm.
planetary sovereign, I suppose, when it comes to geoengineering. And that's an extremely scary, because I mean, you can't possibly make a case that they would do this in the interest of all humanity, right? So this is what the nightmare is constituted of.
Exactly. And you mentioned carbon capture, utilization, and storage. We need to talk about this and the kind of Marxist analysis that you give in the book. This too is a nightmare. I mean, there's lots of ways
Mm,
in which this is a nightmare scenario where this like volatile reuse of the waste of fossil fuel extraction can lead to unpredictable consequences and further ecological damage. This is it feels like in Canada especially like we see further subsidizing of energy companies and the tar sands and so on. It becomes clearly CCUS like an excuse for this race to extract now.
mm,
It's like we're good, like it's okay, don't look away, but if you're going to
yeah,
look at us in these kind of favorable ways because we're we're doing this out of the goodness of our heart. We know we've been part of the problem, but
yeah,
now we're going to be part of the solution. That seems to be largely what this magical technology of carbon capture, utilization, and storage is used for. It's reputation management, basically. You
yeah,
say you
yeah,
say in the book, but there is a dark underside, of course, to that, and it has to do with, as you say, the primary uses of like when we talk about utilization, we're really you say talking about commodification. We're talking about the
mm,
commodification of the
mm.
CO2 that can be captured. Can you talk about some of the uses that these companies are imagining for the CO2? And how Marx, and his sort of writing on refuse, the ways that capital uses its refuse, allowed you to really understand what is going on at the industry level in terms of commodifying carbon through these totally ecologically wasteful processes.
Yeah. I mean, so we talk about, I mean, we rely on Marx there to say that, there's going to be, I mean, Marx has this part where he essentially says that, there's a point at which, it will become attractive for capital to eat its own waste, essentially, and start like, trying to extract value from that. And I think this is exactly what we're seeing in terms of carbon removal. I mean, we talk about the very many there's essentially three ways in which, companies are trying to somehow extract a profit from carbon removal, which then, pushes them away from how carbon removal should actually be used as a kind of form of, permanent sucking CO2 out of the atmosphere.
and
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 so one is
sequest
kind of
and the idea of sequestration, right? This is
exactly, yes,
yeah.
yes. And so one is just, offsets. But I think what you're talking about is the kind of physical ways in which CO2 is being used as a commodity or being turned into a product.
Hmm.
And so, the most problematic one there is maybe enhanced oil recovery, where you put CO2 down into, depleted oil and gas wells. And this is what Occidental is doing in Texas. They're building the largest direct air capture facility, and they're going to use it partly to do enhanced oil recovery. And so you put CO2 down into oil and gas wells that are no longer economically viable. And by doing that, you can extend the lifetime of that well for a very long time in some cases. So this is a direct way in which CO2 is turned into more oil, essentially, right? But then there's also ways in which, commodities can be made from the physical CO2 that you extract from the air. And the most probably scalable one that is being discussed is synthetic fuels. So essentially, you combine that CO2 with some kind of hydrogen atom, and then you have a synthetic hydrocarbon essentially that you can use in existing combustion engines, and that would be a perfect way to, save all of the fixed capital that we have in terms of combustion engines and jet planes and pipelines and so on. Especially for the airline industry, this is being kind of looked at quite closely. There's also promises to do this for road transport, but there the economics looks a lot more questionable, I would say. Um, but there's no end anyway to what you could use CO2 for. I mean, CO2 is the building block of almost everything, right? So I mean, there's companies trying to turn this into synthetic plastics, or you could use it to make food. You can make vodka with it. You could make it into protein. So I mean, there's a lot of kind of ideas out there of yeah, startups trying to find ways of making this into something that they could profit from. Um,
It's that to me is shocking and tempting. Like there's like that combination of like shock and temptation where
mm,
plastics especially have been, a history of us human beings tinkering with
right.
things at the molecular level, and there's this kind of, surreal faith in our own like ingenuity to produce these things that
Mm,
nature historically has produced for free. And in terms of the history, you say that that invention of synthetic fuels has a particularly stark history, right? Like it really is rooted in like Nazi Germany and
yeah.
apartheid South Africa. These are the places where, out of necessity, given that
Mm,
these places become historically, pariah states, they find they find they're in the desperate position of needing to create an alternative to fossil fuels. That's
exactly.
the
Yeah.
that's the history of the technology we're talking
Right.
about here, and that should tell us something, And I think that's one of the
Yeah.
reasons why the long heat is important is that it's not in this kind of ethereal place of like looking at the technology as though it's totally uprooted from those histories. It's saying that like there's no getting away from those
Mm,
histories.
right.
So I mean, yeah, I really appreciate the amount of rigor and scholarship that went into the book. I think it opens up a lot of things that, as you say, you and Andreas say in the book, climate fiction is also attempting to do. And
Mm,
there are two books in particular, The Deluge and Ministry for the Future, that you say are sort of touchstones for you in terms of like the ability to conceptualize the future from the present. Did you almost feel as though, despite the fact that it's a work of very kind of rigorous research, it's all like it's a scholarly book, that you were kind of like doing work that was adjacent to some of these climate fiction books that you kind of revere in some sense for their imagination? Like, to what extent did you feel ultimately like the book was about trying to imagine alternative futures, you know?
Yeah. I mean, so the alternative future part is maybe not very pronounced in the long heat.
Mm,
It's a bit there in the end,
mm-hmm,
um, which I guess would have been the most concrete form of utopian climate fiction, at least. But so, I mean, for us, really, this is about unpacking and criticizing the climate futures that are being projected by you know dominant vested interests and by the, yeah,
mm,
capitalist classes essentially. So in that sense, I suppose it's a dystopian form of climate future, in that we try and lay out like what the future might hold if we continue on the path that we are on, and if we take these investments and promises on geoengineering, carbon removal, and adaptation seriously. Um, and I mean, I wouldn't want to put myself on the same spots or on the same level as the Deluge or Ministry for the Future, but I mean, at least, you know, I mean, what both Andreas and I think, really like with climate fiction is that it is such a fantastic way of helping us both, and I mean, question the boundaries between which we're currently thinking and between which solutions are currently being proposed for climate change. And the deluge in particular, I think, is, I mean, it's a fantastic, there's just so much there that you really wonder. I mean, it's extremely foresightful, I think. So yeah,
mm-hmm.
I think it's a depiction of a climate future that I think is very much in line with what we're seeing happening at this moment in time. Um,
Absolutely, yeah. I see that
yeah,
as
and
well. Yeah.
no, go
Go,
ahead. I mean, I was just going to say that that
please.
really brings in this kind of, the resurgence of fascism, and that talks through, or that, really highlights the authoritarian kind of undercurrents in climate denial and how that is, connected to, yeah, geopolitical questions and repression of climate activists and everything.
Yeah, and I mean, like we kind of we benefit from both, right? Like if Naomi Klein and Astor Taylor want to write
Mm,
about like end times fascism and how
right.
ecofascism, is becoming the order of the day with the denialist in chief and now warlord in chief Donald Trump. Absolutely, we need that book. We need the long heat, and we also, as you say, like need these tomes that are trying to imagine ways out and ways forward, or
Right.
the extrapolation from the present to the dystopian future. Because what I feel like we don't need, and what we largely get from ephemeral media, is I think like a reinforcement of a kind of amnesia, right? Like this
Right.
thing that leads us to be very vulnerable to gaslighting, the
Right.
recurrence of the same with faux novelty, or what you earlier called hype cycles. I mean, like and maybe the last question I'll ask is around AI, which doesn't really come
Mm,
in the book. AI has experienced in the last year an unprecedented hype cycle with
yeah.
just like an almost incalculable amount of investment capital pumped
Yeah.
into this false promise, I would say, that is itself an ecological disaster.
Yeah.
If what we need is to break out of the hype cycle and this recurrence of the same, AI is seemingly the exact wrong technology.
Mm.
Is there anything for you that can be rehabilitated or recovered in AI, or is it for you like totally a false promise? Because I hear both
Yeah.
ideas pitched, right?
Yeah. I mean, so we've been thinking quite a bit about AI since the publication of this book, and it's especially because of the enormous energy demand, right? And it kind of shows so clearly that, you know, I mean, if we can't somehow curb, this kind of default rise of energy and growth, then, it doesn't really matter what you're doing. You're going to end up in a pretty bad place. And I think this is exactly what's happening with AI. Whether it can be rehabilitated, I mean, I think I looked into this a little bit for a lecture I was giving here at a master program in Lund, and I mean, I think there are definitely like theoretical ways in which you could use AI to, I don't know, increase grid efficiency and, manage energy demand and, these kind of things. The main problem, of course, is this is not at all the main way in which AI is being used. It's definitely not why Amazon and Microsoft and Google are investing in AI. So it comes down to exactly the same thing, right? Yes, under a completely different political economic constellation, you could definitely imagine that AI would have some uses, right? This is extremely far away from where we are at the present. I mean, I personally, I think it would be interesting to try and use AI for critical research, for example. There's probably ways in which you could use machine learning tools to, I mean, try and, look at, for example, what oil and gas companies are doing and be able to analyze a much larger set of
Hmm.
documents that you would otherwise could, right? So, I mean, there's obviously like theoretical potential there. But when it comes to this kind of generative AI and the massive hype around that, I mean, it's just 98% it's an extreme waste of resources. And it's going to be interesting. I mean, there's a lot of people saying, it's a bubble. There's no profitability in it. At the same time, I guess we do see the beginning of, you know, productivity increases and labor cuts because of that. So, I mean, it might lead, I guess, to some profitability for at least the big tech companies in some ways. So I think it's going to be extremely interesting to follow now, what happens with AI in the coming years. Yeah. I haven't really thought about it. I think it's something that we all should be more aware of because it will, to some very large extent, determine, I guess, what's still possible in terms of mitigation. Because I mean, if we, you know, end up using 30% of our renewable energy capacity to fuel data centers, then, we're kind of screwed. Um, but yeah, I don't know. It's an extremely important and it's an extremely important question, but it's all a bit up in the air at the moment, I think.
I agree. It feels pivotal, and yet we are just accelerating into
Yeah,
it. From the present, and yeah, it's worrying. I'm like encouraged to whatever extent, maybe just as a communications scholar or whatever, that people are as cynical as they are about it.
hmm.
That feels encouraging, but unfortunately, what we need is more than cynicism. We do
Right.
need the power to regulate it and to
Yeah,
bring it in alignment with human need and survival. And as you say,
yeah.
those are not the priorities. The priorities are how can we capitalize on it as fast as possible and as big as possible.
No,
Um,
I mean, what's encouraging is that there's a lot of pushback, right? I mean, both
yeah,
to data center build out. I mean, there's a lot of like local resistance to building a lot of these massive data centers, but also I think people are fed up with just being force-fed AI in every single appliance that they didn't even ask for, right? I mean, I don't want an AI in every app that I have on my phone, and still it just like keeps popping up. And I think so. I mean, hopefully that will fuel some resistance and resentment, and then. Um, I hope the bubble bursts, of course, and then this will maybe will be but we'll have. I think this is another on the left we'll have to grapple with the implications of this, and of course they go far, far, far beyond just the environmental dimensions of it.
yeah, that's right. Well, thanks so much for your time. It's been really great talking to you, and the book is fantastic.
Thanks so much for having me. It's been a pleasure.